So without any further ado, let's talk about a few things, the muscle spindle and the whole idea of reflex. We're going to start with the muscle spindle. It's one of the sensory receptors, and we need to discuss some of the physiology here. So muscle spindle senses the stretch of a muscle, okay? And structurally, it is located within the muscle. Now, there's going to be some terms, and they may be a little bit confusing. So let me know if they are. I will try to explain them as good as I can. So imagine that this here is a muscle, okay? Whichever, quadriceps, hamstring, biceps, triceps, whatever you want, okay? That makes sense? A big muscle that you can kind of see, right? Consists of multiple fibers. And these fibers that muscle consists of, these fibers are called extrafusal. Do not get any over-the-top meaning into the term. It's just to distinguish between the muscle, the fibers that comprise the actual contractile skeletal muscle, and the fibers that comprise a muscle spindle. So muscle spindle is very small, much smaller than that. It's not up to scale. So these fibers that make up muscle spindle are called intrafusal muscle fibers. Okay, we're good so far? Remember, we're talking about skeletal muscle. Sense a stretch of a skeletal muscle. Let's end this. Okay. Now, since muscle spindle senses the stretch, it's got to have sensory neurons getting out of it. Does that make sense? Taking the signal away from the muscle spindle. So you've got a couple of sensory neurons. They have fancy names. Usually try to use shades of blue for sensory neurons. So there's going to be something like, one of them is called annular spiral ending, and another is called flower spray ending. So annular spiral can sense how big the stretch is and how fast it happens. Flower spray ending only senses the degree of stretch, how big it is. It can't sense the rate of the stretch. Okay, so far we're good, right? So it turns out not only we have sensory endings here, we have a couple of motor neurons. Now, obviously, in order to send the signal to your skeletal muscle for a contraction, you've got to have a kind of a motor neuron that controls your extrafusal fibers. So these motor neurons are called alpha efferent fibers. Again, don't read too much into alpha, okay? But alpha efferent fibers control your extrafusal muscle. Turns out that there are so-called gamma efferent fibers that control your intrafusal muscle fibers. Any questions so far? Let's take a look at the couple of situations that muscle spindle can find itself. Situation number 1. Muscle is not contracted but stretched. So it's going to be a situation when, for instance, imagine I carry something heavy in my hand. So muscles of my arm are going to be stretched. Does that make sense to everybody? So they're stretched, which means muscle spindle is stretched. And due to that stretch, these sensory endings will send action potentials to the CNS with increased frequency. So we can write down this: increased frequency of action potentials. Okay, does that make sense to you all? Now, what if something different happens and muscle contracts? So we're going to start with extrafusal fibers. Basically, look, when I say extrafusal fibers contract, what I'm telling you is that the whole muscle shortens. Does that make sense? Now, here's a little illustration. So imagine that my fingertips represent the ends of the muscle spindle, and the wire between them represents intrafusal fibers. You on board? Good. So when muscle contracts, it shortens, and so should muscle spindle. It will also shorten. If it will shorten, look what would happen to the intrafusal fibers. They will become loose. You see that? If they would become loose, they would lose the ability to send the baseline action potentials at the baseline frequency. So basically what I'm trying to tell you, this is your baseline frequency of action potentials. If your muscle is not contracted but stretched, frequency increases. Okay? If muscle contracts but these fibers would fail to shorten, then action potentials just go away. So what happens in actuality, what happens in real life, when extrafusal fibers contract and muscle shortens, the event that's called alpha-gamma coactivation occurs. Okay, we're good so far? What does that mean? It's a fancy expression, alpha-gamma coactivation, which means a very simple concept. It means that when the motor signal reaches extrafusal fibers at the same time, same motor signal reaches intrafusal fibers, and both extrafusal and intrafusal fibers contract at the same time. Does that make sense? So we can say that as the result of alpha-gamma coactivation, intrafusal fibers contract and baseline frequency of action potentials is maintained. Does that make sense? Okay? So again, alpha-gamma coactivation guarantees the contraction of intra and extrafusal fibers at the same time. We good? Right? Now,